asking a simple question right up front: is virtual leadership really any different? I mean, do we really need to do anything differently when we're leading virtually? I guess you're going to already have guessed that our answer is going to be yes. And then we're going to take a look at the 5 tactics. So you can see on the right-hand side here, we've got this thing called the virtual playbook. In response to some requests from our clients, we've built basically a virtual leader program. But what we're going to do today is, rather than just too heavily promote that, really the key question is, what as a group do we need to do inside our organisations? Do we need to adapt in some way what we've been doing to help virtual leaders lead virtually better? What are the opportunities for us to really add value to our leadership cohorts? And how might we go about doing it? And we're just going to share 5 techniques out of the 34 that are in that book there in some depth, just to give you a bit of a flavour of the way in which we think that it's probably a good idea for us to take a look at virtual leadership slightly differently. Okay, so for those of you who are new, just to give you a sense of the HFL group, I mean, we have basically 3 divisions. HFL is our customized leadership development area, and there's a couple of clients already on the call. Fast Lead is our frontline leader and mid-level leadership program off the shelf, all small group coaching. So that's high growth for us at the moment because it's all done virtually, and that's where this new product vLeader fits in. And Expertunity is the practice of where we put all of our expertship programs, where we're helping experts build enterprise skills. And so that just gives you a bit of a sense. So new normal. And I think I'm very rapidly going to go through some data. So we did a whole pile of surveys in 2015, and then we re-surveyed people in September 2020. Darren Fox, who's our Chief Research Officer, undertook this survey. And, this, I think, is what almost all of you are seeing in your organizations, that before COVID, you can see the green and the purple bar there, sometimes never. How often do you work from home or work remotely? During the COVID crisis, which of course is, in some states still going on, and welcome to all of you from Victoria. I'm so glad that you've got the numbers under control and you're coming out there. We've been really thinking of you. So you can see that during that COVID period, most people have immediately jumped into working from home or working remotely. The most interesting statistic, and this is borne out by a whole pile of client surveys that my clients, our clients have told us about. People are not intending, to go back to this. 44% would like to work from home often in the future. So the question we asked here was, what are your working arrangements would you like to have going forward? So the punchline here is that this sort of concept of virtual leadership, we're not going to go from this back to this. We're going to go from this to this. And even in this sort of a crisis piece here, the leadership that we've all as leaders been having to work with our team probably needs to adapt to a slightly different arrangement where we basically got virtual teams going on all the time. So new challenges, teamwork, collaboration, inter-team communication are going to emerge for most leaders, and leading virtual teams is going to be pretty much standard for all of us. So what did our data say? Well, just very quickly, the view from team members and leaders about productivity. It's well worth asking yourself the question, I think, what would your senior leaders have answered to this question? If on 1st of February, if we suddenly had all of our staff working from home, would they be more productive or less productive? And I've done this with a few groups that we've been working with over the last 5 or 6 weeks. Most of our clients have reactivated, and it's very interesting because most leaders accept that. Team leaders are saying in our survey that 50% of them say that their productivity has gone up, and most leaders are accepting that. On the 1st of February, they would not have believed that, and they would have disagreed, and they'd have probably voted that productivity had gone down. In our survey, leaders actually agreed with team members, and you can't really see the data there. You can see the data, but you can't really hear them with the surprise in their voice, clicking that radio button saying, actually, you know what, their productivity has gone up. So there's a completely new level of trust. I think that's developed over the last couple of months. From a connectedness perspective, we ask questions about how connected are you with your leader. So we ask team members, what's the level of connection with your manager? Most team members are saying it's gone up a little bit. Most are saying it stayed the same. So you can see there's slightly more red than green here. The leaders themselves think actually the connection has improved. And there is a theme all the way through that Darren called out when he presented this a couple of weeks ago, that leaders in general terms think they're doing better than they are in terms of virtual leadership. So that's pretty much a theme. And the next one was amongst my teammates. Again here, sorry, the data is swapped around slightly here, but the red is bad, green is good. So you can see there's slightly more red than green here, which means that team members are saying that the connection between myself and my teammates has decreased slightly, but by and large it's the same. And again here, the leaders are pretty much agreeing almost exactly the same data. So that connection between team members has come off just a little bit, as you might have anticipated. And then this is, for me, is the really, really kicker for particularly many of you who are working in large organizations or global organizations or matrix organizations. While we have been busy focusing on our team through the crisis and making sure that our team members are okay, the thing that has really suffered, the casualty, if you like, is inter-team connection. And in the short term, probably that's acceptable. But if we now know that we're going forward and this sort of virtual leadership piece is going to be in virtual teams is going to be pretty typical going forward for the next year at least, and probably much longer now, you can see that this is the area where probably virtual leaders really need to sit down and say, right, how are we going to repair this damage? We're getting more and more siloed at a moment where we need to be more and more collaborative. So there's really a task involved here. And I'm imagining that the data in your organizations is similar. And please share on chat what the results of your internal surveys are. It'd be really interesting for us to see whether they line up with the sort of data that we have here, or indeed they're different, or indeed any other interesting questions that you asked that we should have asked that you got interesting answers to. So please be collegiate and share. Okay, so and then finally, this was my favorite slides that Darren produced. We've got extroverted leaders mapped against introverted leaders. And what Darren has done here is he said, to what extent did people say things had significantly increased depending on whether you're an extroverted or introverted leader? And you can see that the introverts think that things are absolutely dandy. And one of the challenges, we have introverted people in our business. We've barely seen them since the crisis. They've been super productive. But of course, because they're loving the fact that there's no interruptions and they're able to get a lot of work done at home and what have you, they're imagining that it's much better for everybody else than it is. And as we saw from the productivity data earlier on, I should have called out, 50% of people saying their productivity has improved, but 20% said that it didn't and they're struggling. So 1 in 5 people in our typical virtual team are actually struggling. And the question is whether or not they're admitting that in team stand-ups. And the other question is whether if you're an introverted leader, you're much more likely to think that things are fine than actually they really are. And if you can see, if you're an extroverted leader, you're probably worrying about it a bit more. Okay, so let's talk about a roadmap for virtual leadership. The big question is, and again, I'm going to invite you all to, I can see there's about 30 people on the call, so that means that we need 30 answers. Is virtual leadership really any different? Are we actually just making something up here that's, it's not really anything that we need to worry about, it's perfectly okay? Or is it something that we actually should be concentrating on and that we should worry about? Yes, digital presence comes from the fore, from Lance. Thank you. So that's very interesting, Gail, in terms of the responses have been consistently around 70% on, I can contact my colleagues when I need to, as opposed to having to, be polite and nice to them all the time. Obviously, I think, Gal, you're from the Reserve Bank, and so you've got lots and lots of technical specialists there. And as we have in HFL, the technical specialists are loving it because, generally speaking, they love more autonomous work anyway. So, and I think, Lisa's making the comment here that when we did the research in 2015, it was really, really clear that most people who were working in virtual teams had kind of signed up for it, and they were used to working in virtual teams. There was somebody in WA, somebody in South Australia, somebody in New Zealand, maybe. Of course, the difference now we have is that people are working remotely, but they haven't signed up for it. And, some of them are doing so, that they have to do it. They don't really have a choice. So the nature of virtual leadership, I think, has changed. And, we've got more and more people working remotely that probably, it doesn't suit. And that's the danger signs for a virtual leader. So I think most people here are saying that it is changing team dynamics a bit. And so I guess in terms of, I'm going to turn off chat, and then Grant can give me some thoughts in a moment. But our view of this, having done the research, both in 2015 and now, is that the same leadership principles apply. Of course they do. Leadership is leadership, but virtual leadership requires elevated skills planning and acute observation, and particularly planning. I'd probably, if I had my time again, I'd have underlined planning, because you have to be more deliberate when you're in a virtual scenario, and it's really about smart adaptation. So you're already a good leader, you're already leading your team pretty effectively, but how do you need to smartly adapt in certain areas to make sure that your leadership is as effective virtually as it would have been if you'd been co-located? And that's really the concept around what we are suggesting to our clients, is that they need to help their leaders rethink, adapt, check in, make sure that they are probably adopting a couple of tactics newly that they didn't need before when they were in the office. So, and the good news is that the leaders themselves are actually saying they would like this. So I think certainly in our survey, you're getting permission to provide that, and that would, generally speaking, be high take up. We asked team members, would your manager benefit from virtual leadership training? Half of them said yes. 26% said, they weren't sure. And more than half said yes. And then we asked the leaders in the survey, would you benefit from virtual training? And 63% of them said agree or strongly agree. So, there is a need out there, I think, for this sort of smart adaptation. So what have we done? Well, in 2005, we built a capability framework for virtual leadership that sat on top of a normal leadership capability framework. This is our new one. This is 2.0. Focus on performance is really about just making sure, that we're setting people up for success. Connected leadership is around making sure that all of the connections that we normally had in the office are being replicated and checked in on virtually. Developing virtual teams is something that in virtual teams, in our survey in 2015, one of the key findings was that people who were co-located got more development than people who operated separately. And I think this has probably been accelerated here. Virtual team care is a new capability. We didn't have this in before. We definitely have it in now. I think it's clearly the area where HR has just stepped up and been a shining star in the last 6 to 7 months. Some fantastic wellness materials and programs that have been sent out. And then high performance virtual communications sit underneath it. All right, I'm on slide 14 and I should be on slide 15, so I'm marginally behind. But I might just, before we go to the tactics, I might just stop and ask if there's any key questions or comments. Grant?
At this juncture, we have quite a lot of comments, but I think they're probably actually better to bring into the end if you want to just keep whizzing through.
All right, fantastic. So just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that you might want to think about doing. So we've collected a whole series of data and tactics around what might elevate your virtual leadership or the virtual leadership of the leaders in your organization. This came from the 2015 research, but one of the questions that Darren Fox asked in our survey, which is a very cool question, was, what tactics are your leaders using to virtually that are working? What sort of new tactics, new approaches have your leaders introduced that are really working and are effective in terms of being part of a virtual team? And hello, what sort of tactics have they introduced that are not working? And from those not working, so we've obviously adopted the ones that are working and we've put them in this book, but we've also taken a look at, or in this course, I should say, we've also taken a look at what isn't working, and we've explored why that wasn't working, and developed tactics that stop those sort of things. So as you can see from this front cover, we've basically got 34 tactics that we've developed, and I'm very, very keen as we go through these for any tactics that you have been using and you've seen work really well in your organization. Please let's share them. The whole point here is that we're learning from one another. So hit chat with some great suggestions, and if there's some really good ones that are not in our booklet, no doubt Grant will call them out. So what we're going to do is, as advertised, I'm going to do a deep dive into 5, but we'll give you a bit of an overview. So in terms of virtual capability number 1, focus and performance, these are the tactics that we're suggesting. Purpose, conversation, getting the right meeting mix. We definitely got feedback from the research that there were far too many team meetings and not enough one-to-one meetings. So you can see regular one-to-ones there are another tactic. Making sure that people are clear about their prioritization is very important. I'm going to do a deep dive into mandates and priorities. Resource agreements are really around making sure that people have got the resources to do what they need. And meeting-free zones are those things that we all want and find so difficult to get, so we can actually get on and do some work. So all of these tactics are described in detail. Let's take a look at mandates and priorities. So the challenge here is that it's hard to see what your team member is working on and whether they're prioritizing the right areas of work. And if a team member priorities aren't aligned with what you want, there'll be a significant impact on individual and team performance. So we don't want that. And obviously, when we were working in the office, we could see what people were working on. We could see if there was they're working on the right things. We can't when they're working virtually. So one of the tactics that we highly recommend to virtual leaders is to make sure that these individual mandates here are really clearly, and we're just giving you an example here of one that we use in HFL. So all of the staff members in HFL have this mandate, and basically it's a combination of responsibilities, what we actually want you to do, what percentage time do we want you to spend on things, what are the KPIs, in other words, how are we going to measure that, how do you live the values. By the way, the staff members actually fill in the values themselves as to how they need to show up in order to be demonstrating and modeling those values. What's on their personal growth plan? What's their short-term inspiration? What's their long-term aspiration? How is their role strategically aligned? How does their role add value to us executing our strategy? And what's the REM and BEM alignment? So I'm not suggesting that you use exactly this type of thing, but there needs to be, we think, real clarity around what we're expecting from our staff, and it needs to be documented and it needs to be referred a lot. And because people now are virtual, there needs to be better planning, documentation, and structure around these things than we've always suggested leaders should do this. I guess what we're emphasizing now is that it's even more important. So that's tactic number 5 in focus and performance. And so let's jump on to virtual capability number 2, which is connected leadership. And again, you can see, 7 tactics here. Make social a team challenge. The feedback with the research was A, interesting, and B, really funny, which was, hey, dear virtual leader, why don't you let us handle the social stuff, because you clearly are not very good at it. So virtual coffee runs, getting people out and about, all of those sort of virtual coffee conversations that we have, the incidental, again, coffee runs are things like making the incidental structured and actually happening. The one we're going to jump into is, collaborative working. So let's have a look at this. So conceptually, what we absolutely saw in the 2015 surveys, and we see some evidence of it happening a lot now as well, is that virtual leaders are falling into the trap of running a hub and spoke virtual team, where they're at the center of it. And as you can see, most of the communication is one way and out to their team members. The level of communication between the team members themselves independently is falling away. And the manager is taking all the responsibility for making things happen and what have you. Maybe in the crisis period, in February, March, April, and obviously for a bit longer in Victoria, that was necessary, like, you know, the leader stepping up and what have you, but clearly it's not sustainable. So as a consequence, we need to be moving to making sure that we've got the whole wheel, you know, hubs, spokes, and the rim virtual team, where, you know, you can see that I've added, you know, in the black graphic, you know, the communication is absolutely two-way. And managers are asking for feedback a lot more, not just asking how they are. And also we've added in the blue, there's lots and lots of communication between the individuals. I want you to imagine for a moment that we suddenly were mapping lots of individual teams on this chart, and, you know, wondering, because what has definitely happened is there is less communication between individual teams and group teams. So so in this collaborative working, in the virtual playbook, we talk about the sort of things that managers can do to make sure that they're on the right hand side of the page and not the left hand side of the page here. Okay, so virtual capability number 3, which is developing virtual teams, which, as you can imagine, given that we're a leadership development consultancy, is very close to our heart. Feedback has never been more important, and it's you know, really, really important to do well. Virtual coaching, almost all of our coaching was delivered virtually even before COVID, but now, of course, all of it is. And we're actually getting better feedback because people don't have to travel and so on and so forth. The only thing that probably we're missing is that reflection time after the coaching. Personal growth plans were important before, but they're even more important now. Shadowing, virtual mentoring. Well, one of the key things that we are suggesting to virtual leaders here is make sure your people are still developing. This is how things are going to be now for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And so if you want to hang on to your best staff, you have to be developing them. They have to feel they're growing. And you can't avoid now to put this off until we come back into the office. It's not going to happen. We need to really flex. And we've been doing quite a lot of virtual delivery. And some of it, you know, we're getting higher scores from, because there's things you can do virtually that you couldn't do live in a room. And it's quite fun. I'm just going to focus on this, this one showing the load here. And the challenge is, you know, how evenly is work and project leadership shared across your team? Because what tends to happen, if we just go back to this one here, you see this little person here is really close to the manager, potentially co-located. So, you know, Grant and I, for example, quite often work in the office together. And so, you know, am I allocating more and more work to Grant than I am fairly allocating it across to other people that I don't see as often? That's, you know, sort of a natural thing. No doubt he would say that that's exactly what I'm doing. But the critical thing here is to make sure that the load is shared. And most particularly, that as we move into the new environment, leaders are making sure that collectively and collegiately, the whole team is supporting the whole team rather than everything coming through the leaders. So, you know, to what extent is, you know, work on projects being shared, you know, work on relationships, particularly external relationships, maybe with other teams being shared? Are we sharing all the meetings? You know, is the leader running all the meetings? You know, I don't run any of the meetings in our company. Other people run them. You know, is the reporting being shared? And the buddying up, you know, if you've got 10 or 12 reports, you can't possibly be buddying all of them. So you might need 1 or 2 of your trusted lieutenants to be doing it. But again, it's asking the virtual leader a whole series of questions, like, are you really sharing things very well? Okay, we're nearly at the end. Virtual capability number 4 is virtual team care. As I say, this is an area where I think HR has really done just a sensational job in the last 6 months and really earned its stripes and got a lot more credibility, I think, which is fantastic with the business. Some of these things are really obvious, you know, walk-in meetings, post-call check-ins, you know, creating limits on work hours as the concept of homework and you know, home and work is merged together. But the one I want to concentrate on is learn to see through screens. And this is the, you know, are you okay, but really taken to the next level? So most of the usual signs and symbols leaders depend on to understand the workload, mood and effectiveness of team members are not available in the virtual workspace. How it's more difficult to monitor effort, hours, concentration, happiness. By learning to see through screens, as we're calling it, you can do. So what does that require? Well, of course, if you're not running the meetings, that allows you to sit back as a leader and really, really acutely observe how people, what are they, you know, what are they doing? How are they connecting? We need to give people much more individual attention. We need to ask people different questions. So just asking people if they're okay and getting a nod back, that doesn't cut it. And a lot of the material I've seen in terms of wellness really makes that point. You know, you need to be asking about what's working in terms of working from home, what isn't working, what are they enjoying, what are they not enjoying. What new tactics have they tried that have worked? What haven't? There's a whole series of questions in the playbook for leaders to really up their ability to acutely observe their team. They need to leverage the team so that, you know, they're getting feedback from the team about how people are doing. And most important of all, if someone says, yeah, I'm okay, you don't accept the first answer, you take the time to really check it out. And then finally is high performance virtual communications. Stakeholder mapping is a really critical one here. You can't just communicate through single channel. You need to be using chat, you need to be using email, you need to be using you know, video, you name it. All sorts of channels need to be used. Disputes have an ability to fester unseen in a virtual environment, so we really have to beef up the way that the team understands how they should escalate resolutions, how they should, you know, resolve disputes, get those protocols really clearly. Virtual team management needs to go up to another level. Cross-team catch-ups are absolutely critical now because of that data that we showed right at the beginning, where, you know, even if the teams are staying together, their connection with other teams has really suffered. And, you know, leader loops are really about, are you checking in with other leaders about how they're doing and how you're doing and sharing ideas. But the one I wanted to just focus on is leveraging the diamond. And most of you will be familiar with this. So if you're inside a matrix, if your communication style and your communication protocol really is this sort of bow tie scenario here, it means that most of the communication between teams, or I've said division A, division B here, goes through senior leaders. So a general employee says, oh, you know, hello leader, I've got a problem with division B, can you escalate it? And all of the communications you can see goes through you know, these two leaders. This model, I don't think is sustainable in modern business in general terms, or modern organizations in general terms, but it's definitely not sustainable when it comes to virtual. So there has to be a much higher emphasis on, you know, leveraging communication between general employees. It's what's called the diamond shape. And you can see that the senior leaders are still talking to one another, represented by the orange stuff here, but most of the communication is going on between individual employees. And of course, that means that individual employees need to be good at stakeholder engagement and stakeholder planning. They need to be able to resolve disputes really well. You know, their communication skills need to be really good. They need to have permission to build these relationships. They also need to be reporting back, good reporting back systems on, you know, the interactions they're having with different departments. This is a crucial skill now for all matrix organizations anyway, but in the virtual world, we think this is something that most virtual leaders really need to be focusing on, building the capability of their team to do that. Okay, so very quick advertisement for Fastly V Leader. It's virtuals, videos, playbook. There's self-assessment in there, research-based, rah-de-rah-de-rah. Expert leadership smartly adapted really is what it's about. It's all about really getting people to think about, how am I doing? How can I check that I'm doing as well as I think I am? What ideas am I not using that I should be using? You can see here there's a free test per company on this webinar, and if you email Grant, you'll get a free test of the program, or you could go to www.remoteleader.com. Grant, comments, questions, thoughts?
So we have quite a lot of commentary. I think there's two quite interesting things from Anita. One, I'm going to make one of them into a question, which it was originally a comment. I'm curious why we talk ourselves into what's missing rather than what are the advantages for each team with virtual.
Yeah, it's a great question, and indeed, I literally had a conversation with a client yesterday about the fact that we've just run we just ran last week a 4.5-day virtual workshop. It was normally it's face-to-face, 4.5 days remotely. My God. And Anita, you know, it's really interesting. We had a conversation about the 6 or 7 things that we could do remotely that we could never do if we were in a room. There were some fantastic things that we were able to do that would never have occurred if we were in a residential workshop like we normally would have been. So I do think we do tend to focus on the problems. But as you saw with the introverts, you know, it's not, I think the critical thing is that most people are finding it's more productive. Most people are, however, missing the social interaction they have with their team. And that's why we'll end up, I think, with a hybrid. But there are 20% of people who are really suffering. And, my concern is that isn't it great? We're all being more productive. We're getting stuff done, that those 20% would be, are being missed. And we're not making sure we're touching base with those. I'm also quite concerned, I have to say, with all the leaders that I'm working with who've been taking the heavy load. They've really been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and that's laudable, but it's not sustainable. So I am concerned that people need to get into a new rhythm that is sustainable and collective and what have you. I'm hoping that's answering your question to a certain extent.
Okay. I've also got effectively a follow-up, not exactly a follow-up question, but also from Anita. What about blended hybrid approaches and the challenges where teams are part office and part remote? Any thoughts there?
Well, this is a complete area where we're going to have to learn again. You can argue that when everyone's virtual, that's cool, right? So we have one process. I mean, we're already in this situation at HFL. I'm seeing some of my staff some of the time, and I'm seeing some of my staff not very much of the time, and I'm seeing far too much of Grant. So, this comes back to this point about being deliberate. Like, how often have I spoken to person X? How often am I checking? You can't afford now to just go with the flow. You actually have to plan your connection with people. You have to plan check-ins. And hopefully that doesn't mean thousands of meetings. It just means being very smart and deliberate. And that's what I mean by smart adaptation. And I think we're going to have to keep adapting. The hybrid, I think, is going to be even more difficult than everybody being virtual, actually.
Okay. Gail's asking, what about performance management for a remote team? What pitfalls are there to watch out for?
I think, great question, Gail. I think the pitfall is to believe that you can't give constructive feedback, or you can't hold people accountable over Zoom or over Teams or whatever your video conferencing application of choice is. I'm seeing lots of people say, oh, well, I will wait until we're back in the office to give that feedback. Well, you can't do that anymore. I mean, many of you as HR professionals have been in a situation where you've had to stand people down or even potentially let people go over video. I mean, we would never have agreed that that was a good thing to do on February the 1st. Now we have no choice. So I think performance management principles are exactly the same as they've always been. We need absolute clarity about what we're expecting from our staff, how that will be measured, what's in it for them if they hit those targets, what's in it for them if they don't. All of that needs to be done just as much now virtually as it was before. And we just need to get very good at great coaching skills so that we can have those conversations that work really well over video. And build our confidence in doing so. I do see people putting tough conversations off, and that's not going to work. It's going to create long-term problems. So I think having a conversation, Gail, with all of your leaders about how are we going to do this now we're in this virtual zone, and what should the rules be, and what should if you're being a good virtual leader, how should you do it? I think having those conversations with your leaders is very positive, because it gives you the opportunity to provide all those messages about, we've got to get even more firm about this now, not less firm, I think.
Okay. Margie had said that she's seeing an increase in psychological injuries related to the 20%. Margie, would you be willing to come online briefly and just talk through that?
Yeah. We are seeing an increase in psychological injuries, particularly it's both workers inside and outside. And my thoughts around it is it could be, and it'd be great to get your opinions, a lot of the things you're talking about. If I can't see those people, I'm actually not giving them any work. And it's actually too hard to handle, so I'm just going to ignore it. So how do we empower our leaders, and what do we need to do to help them to actually really see what's on screen, or really what's happening in those tea rooms, to be able to address the issues? Because there's definitely an increase. We've actually got it. We're tracking it, and we're bringing in EAP to help us with resolving the situation.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about something that every organisation is going to see, Margie, in the next 6, well, almost immediately and ongoing. And you know, in terms of the recommendations that we're making in the program and the sort of tactics that we think will help with that, bearing in mind that some people will simply be in very stressed situations through no fault of their own. They'll either been laid off or they're still working for you, but their partner's been laid off. You know, if you're in Victoria, they've been homeschooling for a period of time, you know, and locked away. So the fact of the matter is that people are in stressful situations. Probably, you know, they've been eating into their savings. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on that, you know, in some instances the leaders can't do anything about. But what the leaders can do is at least be a sounding board and can check in with them. And as you say, if you've got an EAP, you know, make sure people are getting support. The sort of tactics that we're suggesting is, you know, spontaneously ring people up, you know, just to see how they are. You know, have meetings without agendas. So don't make all of your communication with your staff task focused. Make sure that you create space to have relationship stuff where you just say, hey, what are you up to today? What's going on? And you know, make sure that you give people. The great thing about a meeting without agendas is that people will talk about the things that they want to talk about, but they never do in a meeting where you've got an agenda and it's all task. Post call check-ins. This is why I'm really keen on people taking like who is quiet, who seemed withdrawn or what have you. So after that meeting, give that person a call, ask them, you know, how they felt the meeting went, what are they feeling. So all of those sort of check-ins. So this is very time, you know, it takes a lot of time. And this is the other reason we're suggesting you need to share the load as a virtual leader. You need to have 1 or 2 lieutenants who are also checking in with people and making sure that everybody's looking after one another. So there's lots of small little things that you can do, but I think you're right, Margie. We are about to see. I'm sure the data will show that there's a lot of people having an extremely tough time, and for all the upbeat, you know, oh, we're being more productive at home. There's a dark side that we really need to look at.
Okay. Just so everyone's sort of aware of the scheduling, we tend to run these officially till 8:45 because people often have to go to meetings at 9 o'clock. But we will continue after 8:45 with questions for people who want to stay and are not in a desperate hurry to get away. So we've had a question from Greg. What are some of the things you can do remotely that you can't do in person? You've sort of discussed some of this, but maybe not a lot of detail.
Well, we've been using chat, and I can see there's, you know, lots of ideas and suggestions and what have you. I mean, one of the things that if you want to get everybody's opinion in a live meeting where, you know, we're in a boardroom like I am now, or in a training session, to get everybody's opinion about something takes 10 to 15 minutes, and it's painful, particularly if somebody's, you know, long and verbose like me. But on chat, you can find out exactly what everybody thinks in about 90 seconds. You can shove people into, you can absolutely make sure that everybody on a program works with everybody, for example, because you can plan it. You don't have to leave it up to chance about who they talk to at coffee. You can make sure that people talk to people they don't know by having virtual coffees and virtual buddy calls. We've been using virtual buddy calls and the participants absolutely love them. And so again, similarly, mandating to your team, if you're a virtual leader, that they must have once a week, they need to spend 15 minutes having a team one-to-one, like, you know, Grant talking, for example, with Joe, one of my team, you know, making sure that everybody catches up. These are things that you can actually plan and make more deliberate. We in our, you know, the other thing is that you can connect people into programs, particularly leadership programs and expertship programs, much more easily. Last week we had somebody from Atlanta, who's their chief sort of guru innovation officer, spend 75 minutes with, you know, 15 experts, and that person just totally inspired those 15 experts. We'd have never been able to do that if we'd have been in a hotel in Manly in New South Wales, you know, together. That wouldn't have been possible. So I think we're just beginning to explore the possibilities of, you know, we're moving away from just replicating what we did live into virtual, and now beginning to really explore the opportunities to, you know, do things virtually that are now much more acceptable than they otherwise would be. And I'm sure lots of other people have got suggestions as to how we're doing it. I have to say that I was very nervous last Sunday about doing a 4.5-day workshop online, but we got very, very high NPS. The participants were superb. You know, it actually, it went off far better than I thought it would. And, you know, I think that's because we're able now, people are used to it, they understand the need for it, and they just want the development. And if it has to be done online, well, no problem. You know, just as long as it's well organized and we're moving people around.
So
how are we going?
We're doing all right. So we have a question from Paul, which I'd actually kind of like to throw out to the group in chat as well. Do people have any comments on software collaboration tools and effect on productivity, whether they're easy to adopt or use? I mean, we use Zoom very extensively, but not a great deal of other tools with it, Al?
Yeah, I think it very much, I think it depends on a whole range of things. I mean, just to give you an example of my experience with using some virtual tools from a facilitation perspective, for example, you know, we've used Mentimeter a bit, and you know, the polling that does in Mentimeter is really good. But for capturing people's views and things like that, Mentimeter is really difficult. You know, so each of these tools seem to have a sweet spot that they're good for one thing, but they try and do everything, and that doesn't work. And my sense is with the collab tools, that's the same. I mean, we've probably got a lot to learn from, you know, tech companies who have virtual teams working on software and software development all the time. So, you know, one of the reasons that Atlassian is such a, you know, great success story for Australia is their collab tools are, you know, sensational and being used by tech teams all the time. So there's definitely an opportunity, I think, to talk to tech teams about, you know, but those collab tools tend to track work and task. They don't track relationship. And as we know, leadership is all about that. So just making sure that we're using tools that, you know, there is no better thing than just simply to ring somebody up. I rang somebody up the other day and they were very excited to have a phone call rather than a video call. And you know, it's about mixing things up and making sure that we're looking at it all.
Okay, and we have a question from Joe. What do you think the role of virtual mental health and counselling professionals are here?
Well, it's going to be vital, I would have thought. You know, I went to see my GP the other day for the first time for ages, and he's missing seeing people live because he thinks he can pick up things easier live. But obviously, from, you know, given the way that things are now happening, we're going to have to be able to see through screens more effectively. I think if we had any question about whether mental health is something that leaders should be worried about and be thinking about and what have you, on the 1st of February, you might argue that we were making some headway there. Now I think there's total acceptance from all the leaders that I'm working with that you know, leaders have a duty of care to be thinking and worrying about the mental health as well as the physical health of their team. And they need to be making sure that they are providing opportunities to speak to, you know, clinical professionals where that's necessary. And there's no downside in that now. People are, you know, in a poor mental state, not through any fault of their own, not for some human weakness, but because circumstances are, you know, extraordinary. And you know, I'm hoping that means there's a really good balance now between, we've got rid of the stigma around, I'm really not feeling okay. You know, I'm hoping that we've made a breakthrough. I don't know, what do people think?
Sorry, I've just lost this one here.
Oh, keep up, Grant.
Yeah, no, I know. The window just moved. Do you have any sort of specific thoughts about making catch-ups more intentional rather than popping over to someone's desk in the moment?
I think this is where one of the feedbacks from Darren's research was that people think we're now over meeting. There was that period of time, and you remember in March and April, there was a period of time when actually we had far fewer meetings. It was great. We got lots more done, and we were questioning, why did we need all those meetings anyway? And particularly, why did I need to be in a meeting for an hour when actually I was only there for, only interested in one topic. Now there's, enormous number of stand-ups and team meetings and what have you. So there's probably too many. I think there needs to be a sensible amount of structured, and there needs to be deliberate unstructured. And that will vary for every leader in every team. But the trick is to have a list of all of the people that you need. This is why we suggest stakeholder mapping. Who are the stakeholders? There should be a map in front of you, behind your screen, and you should be looking at that every day and saying, is there anybody here I haven't spoken to? Is there anyone I haven't caught up with? And every now and then put half an hour in your diary for, sporadic or spontaneous catch-ups. So I think my sense is that it's about using, we've got a smorgasbord of tactics. It's about picking different tactics and using them every now and then. There's definitely no one size fits all, in exactly the same way as there isn't, if we were all co-located and being leaders and we can see our team. So, but I think the odd, ring and catch up. Probably my team are on this webinar thinking he never calls me. So fair enough. You know that later on today you'll get some spontaneous calls. But I do think trying to be deliberate about it is the right way to go.